evening, viewers, and thank you for joining us. Obviously, this is Thursday, and this is Thursday Chat with Pilato. And today we continue the conversation that we started last week. And today we want to hear from the other side of the conversation. So last week's conversation, I had Mr. Musava Chailunga, who was very much in favor of the IMF plan for Zambia. And I must say that he argued his position well. And today we would like to hear from Dr. Grieve Chelwa, who thinks differently and would want to obviously experience the other side of the conversation. Dr. Grieve Chelwa is not a stranger to these platforms. I think we've held him, we've hosted him a number of times, and we're always happy to host him as many times as possible because he keeps helping us understand a lot of complicated issues to do with economics. Dr. Grieve Chelwa, good evening, boss.
Brother Pilato, it's so nice to see you. And it's so nice to be on your page.
Always a pleasure. Yeah. So first to kickstart, I would like, first of all, to understand from your position, and obviously for so many of us, the people of this country that do not really understand, who is the IMF? What is the IMF?
Yeah, that's an important question. So the IMF stands for the International Monetary Fund. Funny enough, it's a UN organization officially in theory, but in practice it almost operates independently of the UN. I mean, one of the ways manifestations of that is that the UN is headquartered in New York City, as you know, and the IMF is headquartered in Washington, D.C. So the IMF is the International Monetary Fund. It was founded at a place called Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in the US in 1944. This is just after the Second World War. And I mean, the principles of founding the IMF were quite laudable. They were good principles. The basic idea with founding the IMF was that just as, households, just as at a personal level, Pilato, sometimes households, people go through financial problems. Sometimes namkwata, sometimes tamkwete filiafine, and you need to access help. So that was the basic principles founding the IMF. You go through short-term financial problems, and just like at a personal level, problem, I always call you, Pilato, something. So in principle, that was the basis on which it was founded. But we live in a world which is also dominated by geopolitics. So at its founding in 1944, the two superpowers were very crucial in its founding, the US and the United Kingdom. And in this very good idea of saying to the Fakoka organization which can help, by geopolitics, right? So they also wanted it to serve geopolitical interests, to further the interests of the US, of Great Britain, the UK, which at that time was a declining power, and the US, which was a rising power. And this is why, for example, that the managing director of the IMF, who's the head of the IMF, is always a European, right? And the managing director of the IMF will always be a European. The president of the World Bank will always be an American. So we need to understand there was a good idea in its founding, helping each other out in times of problems. But in that founding, geopolitics, it's important for people to understand this. And I think for many people who studied the IMF closely, they have seen that over its existence, I mean, it's founded in 1944, officially, I think, started in 1945. Over, I don't know how many years that is, over 60 years of its existence, there's always been geopolitics at play in the way it conducts its affairs. And I think one of them is that one. Just people should know that the managing director is always a European. And that's what bothers me. I mean, if it was really a global institution, now when Pilato talk to our managing director, so there should be an African as a managing director. There should be, should be a Latin American as a managing director. But why keep that position exclusive to a certain geopolitical bloc? Yeah, but basically, so Narande Fingi, but that is the IMF. So the idea is a good one.
That's very helpful. So I'm sure our viewers are happy to know where this IMF is and how the IMF comes through. I'd like to understand, what do you think necessitated the country, our going to the IMF? What do you think put us in a position where we needed the IMF, especially after having had an experience with them that was not properly executed? What do you think necessitated our going back to the IMF this time around?
That's true. I mean, as you've put it quite nicely there, that after a very bad experience, I think I don't need to remind Pilato, I don't remind the audience that we've been dealing with the IMF for quite a while now. I think the most dramatic experience, the most vivid experience that's still in our minds is the experience of the 1990s, what is called structural adjustment programs, right? So this was devastating. I think anybody who's our age, Pilato, remembers basically the havoc that wreaked on families, communities, the copper belt. I mean, this is, I don't need to sort of reiterate it here. I think it's common knowledge. So the question you're asking is, so what necessitated us going back to the IMF? So we need to understand the problem we had, right? The problem we had that we currently have, right? So we borrowed a lot. In the Patriotic Front government, we as a country began to borrow quite a lot. Right. One of the most interesting things I read recently was, funny enough, Dr. Stumbeko Musokotwane was the last Minister of Finance under the MMD government. And his last budget speech, our external debt stock in 2011 was $1 billion. Our external debt stock, we're owing $1 billion. And as you know now, we externally we're owing $14 billion. So this debt has gone up by about 13 billion in 10 years. I mean, this is a rapid rate of increase in borrowing. Right? Now, so clearly we borrowed much more than we had the ability to pay back. I think that's not controversial. Much of that is due to the PF's very careless way in which they approached fiscal issues, right? So that certainly is not a controversial statement to say. So we're at a point now where a lot of the debt that we borrowed is falling due. Right. I do beg your pardon. My kids are playing. So just give me a second. First, my kids are playing. Just give me a second. I'll be back.
No, it's fine. It's fine. It's fine. We want to know there's life behind you. Yeah. Yeah. So we want to understand what the IMF, who the IMF is, and why do we need the IMF now?
Okay, so they were just playing outside the office. They want their daddy. So basically, so the problem we have at Pilato is that Nkongole Shingishi is falling due, right?
Yeah.
So we've got a Eurobond that we borrowed in 2012. The first one, $750 million, is due next year, next year, 2022. And we have two others that are due shortly thereafter. So we've got what is called, technically, I'm an economist, that we've got a balance of payments problem. So what that means in layman's English is that we've got a problem of a shortage of foreign currency, right? Now, the thing is this. I want to the people we borrowed from, the people who lent to us, if they could accept our Zambian kwacha, the problem would be a simple one. We would just print a little bit of this kwacha to our pay that money, we're paying back. But these people don't accept the Zambian kwacha. They want a US dollar, right? They want a greenback. Now, we don't produce US dollars. We don't produce US dollars. US dollars are printed by the Federal Reserve Bank in the US. How do we earn US dollars? We earn them by exporting. So in the Twashita export copper, Twashita export flowers, we export, every time we export, the people who are buying our exports are paying us in US dollars. We get those US dollars, we use them to meet our external obligations. Kwatin Kongole, buying crude oil, Filafin. So basically, we have a shortage of foreign currency over the next couple of years. We've had a shortage for a while now. And that's the reason why in the PF government, Mwalimu, the exchange rate was depreciating. Kwacha lose value a lot. That was really a sign that we were experiencing a balance of payments problem. We had a shortage of foreign currency, and it was protracted because it's been happening for the last 5, 6, 7 years. People who've been following the exchange rate basically know that. So when you have a shortage of foreign currency like this and a protracted one, you need some assistance. So you need somebody to plug that foreign currency shortfall externally. Traditionally, the way it has happened, what has happened is that when you have this, what is called a balance of payments crisis, you go to the IMF. and you ask for assistance, right? IMF, remember the founding principles in 1944. You go to the IMF and you basically ask the IMF for assistance, and the IMF will say, okay, we'll give you US dollars, we'll give you a US dollar loan for a period of time, but because we are a bank, right? Because we're a bank, we also want to make sure that you won't misuse it. So we'll put some conditions, and we can come to this conversation of conditions later. So this is basically what necessitated us going to the IMF, because we've got a shortage of foreign currency. Now, it is important for the audience to distinguish that, you know, a shortage of foreign currency can have different sources, right? So, I mean, often the shortage may be as a result of you export copper, for example, like we do, and then the price of copper collapses on the international markets. So, Nishi, the US dollars that are coming in, yala cheaper. So you have a shortage. In our particular case, we have an interesting case where the shortfall is a result of debt obligations that are falling due, right? So this is why it's also important to understand the source, to diagnose, as doctors will call it, to diagnose the source of the disease, right? The source of the balance of payments crisis is not necessarily that we have a shortage because of export receipts, because of inflows from exports. The shortage is primarily because all of a sudden we're going to experience huge, in the next couple of years, we need to pay in Congole. So that's triggered the balance of payments crisis. So now when you know this, but when you diagnose the disease that way, then the solutions can be quite different. And that's the part I think I disagree with the government, right? Because if the shortage of foreign currency is as a result of debt obligations that are falling due, perhaps there's another avenue. Perhaps one way to approach is to negotiate. Now, what I want to sit down with them, have a discussion with them, and try to defer, restructure those kinds of things. But I suspect we'll get into much more detail shortly in the conversation. But that is why Pilato went to the IMF, because we have a balance of payments crisis, a shortage of foreign currency. Yeah.
So, what is the option? What was the option? What do you think would have been the option for us as a country between going to the IMF and what? What do you think would have been an option for the government between IMF and what?
I think that before I can answer that question, I think it's important we have a discussion about process, right? I think one of the things that disappointed me a little bit about, it's difficult to be disappointed by President Hichilema, certainly an inspirational figure himself. But one of the small things that has disappointed me is a process issue, right? So if you recall, when he was elected, when he was voted into power on August 12th, and then I think that when finally confirmed on August 14 or August 16, I've forgotten the day, in that transition week, in that period of transition, when we were waiting for him to be sworn in, he had an interview with the British Broadcasting Corporation with, I think, Focus on Africa. And the first sort of interview he had with a media organization. In that interview, he made a couple of statements. One of them, which bothered me at the time, is that he, at the time, confirmed that we were going to go the IMF route, right? This is before he had constituted a cabinet, those kinds of things. So I think for me, as a process issue, I wish at that time he had left the options open, right? Leave the options open, put together your cabinet very quickly. The president has got lots of resources at his disposal. Maybe put together a small team, a committee of experts, or one way or the other. I don't know if I mean, I'm not a lawyer by any chance, a constitutional lawyer, but maybe you could invoke the Inquiries Act. I don't know, but you could do a very quick sort of commission of inquiry light or commission of inquiry type of arrangement. Put together experts and tell them we've got a balance of payments problem. We've got a shortage of foreign currency. I'm giving you 30 days to go out there and give me options that we can consider to solve this balance of payments problems. One of the options might be the IMF, might very well be the IMF, but explore the universe of options, right? And I think had he done that, we would have gotten a much better solution. So the first objection is one of process. I think at the time we made the IMF so inevitable, I think we would have left that boat a little bit open, constitute a committee of experts. We've got very smart people in this country, lots of experience, different backgrounds, experts in deal structure, etc., etc. That committee would have given a report, an objective report back to the president with different options and different trade-offs. As you know about Pilato, there is no free lunch, as they say in economics. So it's not the case that if we go for this option, it is a win-win option entirely. Every option has trade-offs. And what the president needed to know, he needed to know the universe of options, and at the same time, the trade-offs related with each option. What are the benefits? What are the costs? And then can we pick an option with the limited costs and a maximum benefits? So that wasn't done. So one critique is a critique of process. I'm hoping going forward, before we do seismic policy changes in the economic sphere, at least there's a consultative process. There's a process by which we constitute a team of experts, etc., etc. So that's the one thing that I wish had happened. Now, coming to the question of what was the alternative, right? So, had I been on this now, I mean, obviously, Grieve Chelwa is nobody, but say dreams, hypothetically, had I been on this particular panel, one of the options I would have pushed, and there are several. One of the options I would have pushed is an option of seriously engaging with our creditors, negotiating with them seriously, right? And there's many tactics one can use to do this. For example, by Pilato, you know this. Our creditors are the people who lent money to us. We didn't force them to lend the money to us. Hello, we didn't force them to lend the money to a careless government, a patriotic front government, which was careless. They didn't do it just once in 2012. They did it 2 times thereafter. They did it in 2014 and 2015. When even by 2015, it was very clear that this government is a careless government. But these guys abroad kept on lending money to the patriotic front government. So they have a role to play. There's some blame. There's enough blame to go around, both internally and domestically. So we could negotiate on that basis. Make the argument, we've got a new government in place right now, right? You guys were very careless in lending to Edgar Lungu's government. You knew at that time this was a careless government, but you continued supporting it. So now, we're not terrible people as Zambians. We're honorable men and women. We want to honor our debt, obviously, but things have changed. So, let's meet halfway, right? Can we defer some payments? Can we restructure, etc., etc.? And that's why I said it's also very important to have, to have had a team of experts who understand these things. We've got lots of Zambians abroad, lots of Zambians domestically. The president himself has often told us time and time again that he's an expert on deal structuring. So I wish he had brought his expertise to bear on this problem, right? For me, I think this avenue would have been an option with maximum benefits but limited costs. Remember, every option has trade-offs. Every option has a benefit and a cost. To my mind, going straight to negotiate with the creditors would have been an option with maximum benefits, limited costs. And by the way, if you recall by Pilato, in the wake of President Hichilema's election, remember the Goodwill. I mean, it's sort of, naturally Goodwill does erode over time, but remember the Goodwill that we had both domestically, internationally, just when he was elected. We should have struck the iron at that time when the iron was hot and gone directly to the creditors, try to engage them, as opposed to going through the middleman of the IMF. So that's the argument I made. I mean, friends of mine who think about deal structuring, they've also thought about the different sort of options. I've been talking to people in finance who can think about many ways in which one could resolve this balance of payments. Remember, the problem is a shortage of foreign currency. There are some colleagues, for example, who've been looking at, I'll shut up in a second. There are some colleagues, for example, who've been looking at projections in the mining industry, and they've looked at the price of copper, over the next decade, and so on and so forth. And some folks have made the argument: is it possible for us to get some of this foreign exchange shortage that we have from the copper industry, given that we have copper trading at historic highs of $11,000 per metric ton? That's also an option, right? And there are many other types of options. But the important point, before I keep quiet by Pilato, is a process one. I wish the president had left it open at that time, constitute a committee of experts, and then very quickly these experts give the president a set of options that nicely enumerate benefits and costs. So the president has got a universe of options on his table before he can pick an option. And I think that way it might have been easier for him to justify whatever option he had gone with.
So I don't know if I'm correct, if I'm right. But I remember, I think one of his trips to the UK, I think there was an announcement that they had met with the Eurobond holders. I don't know if could that be the time that they had a discussion. Do you think that is the time that they had a discussion on these Eurobonds?
Yeah, I remember. Yes, you're right. When he came back from the Glasgow climate?
From 26,
Yes,
I think
yes.
he got into London, and I think we remember there was a meeting. Don't you think that's the time that he had with a meeting with the Eurobond holders? I'm asking that because they've been very clear. The government has been clear on when saying that they needed credibility. They needed some form of assurance that in their relationship with or in their conversations with the Eurobond holders. I'm assuming that from the initial meeting that they had in London, probably they have indicated that how do we trust your government when in the past we've had ABC as a problem.
Yeah, by ABC you don't mean Alexander Waliachikwanda. I'm just pulling your leg. No, but you're right, Pilato, that he met the Eurobond investors. But as I imagine, this is a high-level meeting, involving a very busy head of state with a very busy schedule. Again, we go back to the process comment that I made. Had we constituted a committee of eminent Zambians to do this negotiating on our part, it can't be the president's job. Certainly, he can supervise the process, but the nitty-gritty cannot be left to the president. In any case, we also have to be careful that Eurobond investors, and like any person in this world, they will make self-serving arguments. They'll make arguments that look out for their interests. President Hichilema is not the president of Eurobond investors. He's a president of 20 million Zambians, right? So we have to understand there that they will make arguments like, Imwe, before we can talk, you have to engage the IMF. Well, okay, that's a condition you're putting. We might very well reject that condition and say, again, it's important to understand narratives. Again, we say, Imwe, you are the guys who lent money to a patently, objectively careless government. You have no standing to actually even make a statement about Hichilema's administration. So Hichilema's administration has no credibility. Come on. Look at the government that they lent the money to, the PF administration. So you don't even have any standing, first of all. So let us negotiate like adults. There's enough blame to go around, but let us negotiate going forward, right? You are telling us we should go the IMF route before we can talk. Now, as a sovereign state, we have exhausted the options. We've looked at benefits versus costs, not just for the Zambian government, but for the Zambian people. That's important. And based on this calculus, we are going to negotiate with you directly, right? So that's all I'm saying. So it's an important point to understand issues of process. And I think there's more sort of criticism one can also level at this general idea of process, right? I mean, the speed within which we've concluded this thing, right? Very little oversight from Parliament, very little oversight from different constituencies, or at least even inputs from different constituencies, Zambian populace. A lot of it has been done in secrecy. As we stand now, we don't know exactly what the conditions are, line for line. We don't know. I think I heard no lesser person than the former Minister of Finance, Ngandu Peter Magande, for example, making the same statement this week, where he also referred to this issue of secrecy. So I think process-wise, the whole thing has really been disappointing, at least to my mind. And it could have been done differently.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Sheila. I would like to understand now, on the assuming that we got the the West deal, like assuming that, so we don't know what's in the conditionalities. Assuming that we got the West deal, what do you imagine to be the situation for the ordinary Zambian in the next 1 year?
I mean, actually, it's not just the next 1 year, it's the next couple of years. It's going to be horrible, right? And we've seen indications of it. So, for example, this issue of removing subsidies on electricity and fuel, right? This is, by the way, this is a linchpin. This is like um, a typical policy of the IMF, right? The IMF distastes subsidies, right? It distastes subsidies in general. So I'm not surprised, for example, that the government is signaling to the IMF that we want to play ball with you guys, and therefore we're going to remove subsidies because to alisho IMF tamate mama subsidies, right? So this is sort of a sign of things to come. So removal of subsidies on its own on electricity and fuel sets off a whole chain reaction, as you know, by Pilato. You know, petrol, diesel, electricity are an input into the production process of any country, right? Where you and I are having this conversation because it's powered by energy, it's powered by electric energy, right? So when the prices of an important input to the random economy is at a raw material, it's like whatever namayo bepiko wali ku market, a raw material is uhunga, you know. So when the price of an important raw material, an input goes up, like energy is so important. I mean, the energy content of goods and services that we see in our shops, in our shelves, is so high. They have to be transported from one place to another. They have to be manufactured. They have to be preserved in a fridge, etc., etc. So the energy content is very high. Now, when the price of that important input goes up, then the price of the final good and service has to go up as well, right? And then this can set off a whole chain reaction. Now, in a country where the majority of our people, I don't know what the latest statistics are, but more than 50% of our people, perhaps 60 to 7% of our people are poor, which is to say they live on $1.90 or less per day, right? That's a reality of the kind of population we have in this country, that of 60-70% of people live on $1.90 less per day. The Shingayo, about 18 kwacha or so less per day. These are ultra poor people. And then if the price of an important commodity goes up, I mean, it's going to wreak havoc on their welfare, right? Some colleagues of mine have sort of done the calculation. So that's one angle. Now, but the important point, so that's an illustration of what's coming. The important point is also to realize, even though we don't know the conditions that the Zambian government has agreed to, right? Studying what has happened to other countries, studying the behavior of the IMF over the last 70 years, we kind of tend to know what's coming, right? Basically, the IMF wants what is called fiscal austerity. Basically, the IMF wants government expenditure to decline relative to the size of the economy over a certain time period. Right now, basically, the size of our over expenditure, the size of what is called a fiscal deficit ilandati, government expenditure versus what we take in tax revenues. We're spending more than what we take in tax revenues, right? The size of that gap is 10% of GDP. The size of that gap is 10% of GDP. The IMF is telling us that deficit has to go down over the next 3-4 years. So you have to slow down your expenditure relative to the size of your economy. That's the definition of austerity, right? And that's problematic because we're a poor country. We should be ramping up expenditure at Pilato. We need to employ people. We need to create jobs. We need to build hospitals. We need to give out bursaries. We need to invest in our population, right? But what the IMF is telling the UPND administration, and that's contained, by the way, it's not me making up these numbers. It's contained in the IMF's World Economic Outlook report. They publish one every year. The latest one is October 2021. I invite the audience to look at it, and you will see there's a projection for Zambia. It says the fiscal deficit will have to go down from 13% of GDP in 2020 to 1% of GDP in 2026. right? They're asking us to wipe out an expenditure of about $4 billion over the next 4 or 5 years, right? So this really tells you things are going to be rough. And that's why I often wonder when I hear the UPND government, and I have all the respect for them, and I want them to succeed. But I often hear them making the argument that when we make savings from subsidies or from farmer input support program or from this type of expenditure, we will redirect it in this direction. I think it's going to be a tough juggling act, precisely given what I've just said now. They have to slow down expenditure to the tune of almost $4 billion over the next 5 years if one looks carefully at the projections contained in the IMF's World Economic Outlook. Again, if one looks at history, if one looks at the behavior of the IMF over the last 70 years of their history. It's going to be a tough time, basically.
Assuming it's the best deal that they got, what do you think our economy would look like? Assuming that the government got the best deal from the IMF, what should people look out for to see as a reality for them?
Now, Amy, you're putting me in a difficult situation because I don't think it's the best deal. I really don't.
Yeah, I'm assuming. I would like to paint a picture that feeds into different perceptions, and so now we see what the negative would look like, and the government, for example, insists that this was a very brilliant idea or approach. From where you stand, from where you sit, what does the positive, assuming that this was the best deal? I'll give an example. I'll share a thought that I got from Mr. Musaba Chailunga, who argued consistently and confidently that why is it that we have to think that the Zambians and the Zambian government could settle for a bad deal? So assuming that they did not settle for a bad deal, assuming that they argued and negotiated for the good of this country, what is one thing or two things that you feel could be visible in the next 1 year or the next couple of years?
So, Pilato, the most important thing about economic policy is there's never such a thing as an ultimately good deal for everyone. In any policy, there are winners and losers. This is what we often, teach our students, that there's no economic policy that benefits everybody entirely. There's always winners and losers. So the question we ought to be asking is, good deal for whom, right? I think this is a good deal for private sector. This is a good deal for banking sector. This is a good deal for people like me who have been fortunate enough to be highly educated and can therefore benefit from some inflows of foreign direct investment that might come with this deal. But it's a terrible deal for the majority of our people who rely basically on government largesse, who rely on government keeping energy prices low so that they can eke out a living for themselves, who rely on bursaries, who rely on subsidized inputs for agriculture, who basically rely on government, right? This is basically how you deal with poverty, right? You have to have a big government that can essentially do this kind of redistribution, provide services, adequate services to the people, education, health, proper schooling, proper agriculture, those kind of things. So again, we always have to ask when we're thinking about economic policy, is a good deal for whom? There's no such a thing as that's why I said at the beginning that a process issue, the president should have constituted a committee of experts. That committee would have given him benefits and costs and have been very clear, Mr. President, this approach will benefit this constituency and harm this constituency. This approach will benefit this constituency and harm that constituency, and so on and so forth. So yes, we will see, we might see, some what you call macroeconomic indicators, stabilizing a little bit, but our people cannot eat macroeconomic indicators, Pilato, Mwalishi, but they will not eat at inflation. They will not eat an exchange rate. Our people need, our women who work at Soweto Market need lower fuel prices so that the bus fare is low, so that when they wake up at 4 a.m. in the morning to go and order tomato ku City Market, they can afford that particular aspect. Now, if the bus fare goes up, as it has done, And it's bound to do even more because we expect that these increments are going to happen quite regularly. That's what the Energy Regulation Board told it was. Every 30 days, they will revisit pricing. This woman is completely this woman who's trying to do the best she can. She's born poor, not because she decided to be poor. Circumstances got her there, right? The 1990s experiment got her there. Now, this person's life will be harmed. So this is how I answer the question as an economist, right? Now, so for me, I'm going to be biased. I care for the poor. This is how I do economic policy. I think a lot about the poor, the marginalized. And for those people who I care for, I think this is a bad deal. Now, for the well-off, this is a grand good deal, right? If you've got an MBA, you work in a financial sector, I mean, it's going to be good times for you. But those good times will not trickle down to the rest of the population. That's what is very sad here. Yeah.
Okay, so let me pick a few questions from our viewers so that we can allow them to be part of the discussion. This one is coming from Sting Kanga. Sting Kanga says, Pilato, the US print dollars and give us as debt. We in turn pay out of our resources. Are we not able to borrow locally?
Should I answer that directly? Or
yes,
you
please.
like
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yes, please. Yeah.
I mean, that's a fascinating comment coming from Sting. Now, so we have to understand certain things. So borrowing in principle is not such a bad idea, right? So the reason why we need to borrow in US dollars is because, when we are trying to build roads, bridges, hospitals, materials, which we use in building those things, which cannot be found domestically, right? So for example, I'm not an engineer, but I'm going to guess, like when you're building a road, qualified bitumen, tar, we don't have crude oil. I think bitumen and tar and those things are byproducts of the refining process of crude. Now, we don't have crude oil in this country at this point in time. Maybe we have some, but we haven't exploited it. So we need it to come from abroad. Now, to buy it from abroad, it's like Pilato Moyapa Bay. But you don't go there with amakwacha filafini. So exactly. So Sting, I would say, in principle, borrowing is not so bad, particularly if you're borrowing to invest. You're building roads, bridges, hospitals, the kinds of things that you need to invest in your people so that it can enhance their productive capacities, right? So it is just the way the PF did it. They did it disastrously, right? They borrowed carelessly. They also borrowed for very short time horizons. You can't borrow 10 years at it, and then in 10 years, it will generate income to pay back. I mean, as you know, Abasungu, but send them a mortgage, but they borrow to buy a house for 30 years, right? So that 10 years was very short. And this is why I keep saying the creditors have got blame here. They willingly lent to a government which said, we'll borrow for 10 years kupanga misewero tukabwesha. You see that kind of they've got some blame to play in this way. So Sting, the point is to say it's not bad to borrow. Also, the other thing what Sting is driving to, the other point that Sting might be trying to make is that we also have copper, which generates US dollars. Remember, the US dollars are very precious for us because we use them to buy imports. So I think Sting is making the argument, why don't we raise more revenue from the copper sector also to supplement some of these initiatives at borrowing? I think that's an important question. And again, coming back to my lovely government, we've given, as you know, Pilato Marium for budget speech, Sokotwani, we've given the mining sector tax, we've given them tax relief, right? We've dropped the corporate income tax rate from 35 to 30%. We've made the mineral royalty tax deductible. I mean, we are giving them through. I mean, we're leaving dollar bills on the sidewalk like that, right? In a moment when we're in shortage of US dollars, right? Why don't we tax them a little bit more? Why don't we figure out ways of collecting more revenue from this God-given resource? Nile sawa tupere. Tewa nankani, tewa Glencoe, wanankani, nile sawa tupere if it belongs to us as Zambian people. And that's Sting's point. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So before I go to the next question, I'd like to understand. So one would argue that those tax relaxing conditions or tax holidays that you make mention of, the government would want to give enough room to these corporations or these employers, so then they can make more profit and employ more people. And when they employ more people, then the government will have expanded its tax base. Don't you think that could be the rationale behind such policy movements?
I will now bring my expertise to bear on this question because that's a theoretical argument, right? The
Yes.
important thing is to bring that argument to the data empirically over time. When we look at history, what often happens when you give tax incentives to multinationals? Does it lead to the materialization of these benefits, which you illustrated? The evidence says no. Actually, what these guys do, by the way, remember these we've been given the mining houses incentives for 20 years since we
Mm,
privatized, and they continue to employ very few of our people. In fact, the trend in mining is to substitute machines in place of people. That's what mining is does. Not only do
mm,
they continue to employ less of our people, but they also continue not to pay the taxes when their operations have taken off. So basically, the evidence on people who studied the relationship between tax incentives and the benefits, right?
mm,
What these people find is that actually multinationals are very clever at arguing for these incentives, but not delivering the benefits to justify the cost. Remember, when we're giving away this tax incentive at Pilato, it is a cost we're incurring, right? We could have been
mm,
taxing them, but we're
mm,
giving them a gift, and that cost is a vivid cost. Remember, it is a school not built, it is medicine not bought, it is textbooks not bought, it is university students not given meal allowances, not given bursaries, it's universities not built. This cost is real. Now, for this cost to be justifiable, those benefits have to come in. But the empirical evidence is very clear. You give them this incentive, they will chow the incentive, and then they will not deliver the benefit. In fact, remember in the 1990s, we gave so many tax incentives in FTJ to a lot of
mm.
those South African companies. Up with a tax holiday. Remember what they used to do? They used to close
Very
shop
good.
and do what? And run away. That's
Okay, so
that's
this one is coming from. Sorry, doctor. This one coming from Sava Chailunga, the gentleman I hosted last week. So he
ah,
says, what is the cost of using the IMF versus other lenders? Using actual numbers, not just assumptions. For example, can Dr. Chelwa say the IMF will X as opposed to Y with other lenders?
Mr. Chailunga, it's an honor to get a question from you, and thanks for this question. Now, it is important. So, as an economist, my understanding of cost is quite exhaustive. So, I imagine Mr. Chailunga is referring to the nominal interest rates, right? So,
Yes.
Mr. Chailunga is making the argument: if we borrow 1.4 billion from the IMF, what is the interest rate versus if we borrow the money from external sources, right? And by the way, I'm not making the argument about borrowing from external sources. I'm making the
Mm,
argument about negotiating. But be that as it may, suppose okay, interest rate from the IMF, if the interest rate, if you had to go to capital markets. Now, the important point to know in answering that question, cost cannot be limited to just a nominal interest rate. Yes, the IMF lends at some of the lowest interest rates around, but the important point is part of that cost calculus, part of the conceptualization of cost should add this huge pain we're going to inflict on our people. Conditionality itself is a cost, right? The loss of policy sovereignty, the fact that every time you're writing up a policy, you have to look to Washington, D.C., that's a cost. It puts you in a straitjacket. The fact that you have to reduce subsidies, the fact that you have to reduce, I saw Minister Msokotwane just last week in a recent presentation he made to creditors. He has argued that they're going to reform the farmer input support program. They're going to reduce how much money they spend on the farmer input support program. That is a cost that we have to incur, right? The fact that our students cannot get a meal allowance, that is a cost. So, Mr. Chailunga, to the cost calculus, right, to the calculation of total cost, one should not be misled to just think about the nominal interest rate alone, because the conception of cost should add conditionality and all these other things that we have to sacrifice in trying to get this IMF deal. And by the way, this thing of sacrifice is not just something coming from Grieve Chelwa. The government itself, the Minister of Technology, Mr. Felix Mutati, said, I think on his own interview on ZNBC, I can't quite recall, but it was carried in the news diggers.
yes.
Yeah, he said pain is coming. So Minister himself says pain is coming. So that pain, Mr. Chailunga, has to be added to a discussion of cost. This is not a technocratic debate where we just limit our conceptualization of cost to nominal interest rate. This is not a problem for finance people alone. This is a problem for Zambians at large, and we have to have a very universal conception of costs.
This one is coming from a comrade of ours, Kabanse Ntitima, the third. So he says, always refreshing listening to Comrade Dr. Grieve Chelwa. Just a quick question. So many comrades have maintained that we have a lot of alternatives on the table aside from the IMF. One, what are these realistic, practical alternatives? Secondly, the second one is, in the current state of our economy, would these alternatives yield the $3 billion we need to give our economy a boost we desperately need in the short term?
Yeah, always nice listening to Kabanse Ntitima the third. Yeah, that's a good question. First of all, I don't know where Mr. Ntitima the third is getting the $3 billion number. Again, this is why process is very important. When I look quite carefully at the country's balance of payments accounts, by the way, one of the things that's very depressing is that I haven't seen balance of payments projections from the Ministry of Finance. I have seen projections from the IMF. So the IMF has projected for us that over the next couple of years, shortage of foreign currency on an annual basis will be some amount. Right now, as you know, Pilato, a projection, so it means the projection has assumptions, and you need to interrogate the assumptions. Some of them are not very realistic. For example, they were assuming that the price of copper is $5,000 per metric ton. We know it has doubled now, it's 11,000 per metric ton. So those projections have to be updated. When I look at those projections, and I really would like to see the Ministry of Finance's alternative projections, because what one sees, by the way, is that in the IMF projections, when you look at the Article 4 consultation reports, they've got their own projections, which says, without the IMF, fintu Phoebe, with the IMF, fintu Fikawama. That's it's a self-serving argument. I mean, it's like Pilato. If you don't come to me, things will be better. That's a self-serving argument. But I would really have liked the Ministry of Finance to give us its own projections so that we can actually interrogate the projections, the assumptions. Now, when I look at those projections, by the way, the IMF's projections, it's not clear to me, Van Titima, that the money we need is $3 billion. It's not quite clear. I mean, those projections do give a shortfall, which is rather modest, by the way, with the assumption of like a lower copper price. So when the copper price is much higher, forex inflows are much higher, especially if we can tax appropriately. So the shortfall is much different. So I don't think the shortfall is $3 billion. I think that's a huge number, and I don't know where that number comes from. Now, when it comes to the question of alternatives, right? I've got a favored alternative. There are some colleagues, I've got some finance friends, for example, who've proposed, you could issue refinance, which is to say you could go back on the capital markets and reissue a different bond, a new bond to pay off the old bonds, right? Folks have put those there. I mean, I don't know what sort of the mechanics of that look like, but it's very interesting. And again, as a process issue, these are the options we should have had on the table. My own favored approach would have been to negotiate directly. And perhaps that process would have led us to a combination of different kinds of solutions, right? So I think as a process issue, my plea to this government, my plea to the president, my plea to the Minister of Finance is that going forward, let us make these processes widely consultative, right? Certainly the answers don't lie in people like me or whoever, but I imagine if you put together a committee of people with diverse viewpoints, you get the best kind of solution out there. Right. And by the way, one of the things that's been very interesting, I must tell you about Pilato, is that Lazard, who was appointed by PF, remember Lazard, the French, is it an investment bank? I don't know who they are. This government still maintains
advisors.
Yes, this government still maintained them. I take issue with that. I wish what the government would have done is precisely, you could maintain Lazard if you want, but pretty much get an independent committee of Zambian experts, people who are rather patriotic, to also give a different point of view, right? Lazard, these are French investment bankers. I don't know if they care about my grandmother who for la fils Kumushi, Tetinjishiwe, but it would have been very important to have an independent team of experts really coming up with different sets of options. So that's the point I'm making. I think one of the things that folks should take away from this conversation with Pilato is that the important point is the point about process. I think process-wise, we did this thing in a very, very strange way. I wish it had been done differently.
This one is coming from Lakson Ivwananji Simbe. Mr. Lakson says, reviving the economy, it's a process, Dr. Grieve, unless you have surplus money for payment, but austerity measures are inevitable this time, although it's a bitter pill to swallow.
Yes, I mean, I agree with Mr. Simbe that reviving an economy is not an event. It's a process. It takes time. But the thing that I take umbrage with, the thing I disagree with Mr. Simbe on, is on the austerity. Austerity was not inevitable. Austerity came as a condition of the IMF route. The route that we took to go with the IMF made austerity inevitable because the IMF worships at the altar of austerity. That's their raison d'etre. That's in their DNA. That's who they are right now. Remember, I made another argument of going to negotiate with the creditors. The creditors take a haircut. The creditors, we agree on different payment terms. We reschedule. Your local nankani, our Kalava neighborhood. They can do because ingana kulipira fia pale low abanata ba ekuskulu. So give me some space. Give me some breathing room. Eka tumfwane. Elo yewe mambara wampere lyankongolo twali muba. Elo nale nwa. Elo nale kolwa. So even you've got you should share in the blame. You should share in the blame anyway. So I think no, the importance of energy. So, but to answer Basimbe, I think the point I'm making is that he's right. Recovery is a process. However, austerity was not inevitable. Zambians need to know that. Austerity became inevitable because we picked a particular path which we made inevitable for Ebene. But I wish we had left the policy window open 3-4 months ago, especially at a time when our president had so much goodwill. We should have exploited that goodwill and pretty much put into motion a process that delivers a report to the president that is exhaustive in options, gives the president benefits and costs of each policy option. No policy option is without cost. All of them have costs, one or the other. The important point is which one of these options has the most limited cost. I wish that report had been given to the president. I wish the president had asked for such a report coming from a committee of Zambian experts who are also patriotic. We have to understand that these things are really, really. This is how our friends formulate policy, pretty much.
This one is coming from Tuambo Amusute. I hope I pronounced that name properly. Mr. Amusute says, maintaining the deficit means government has to keep borrowing, especially domestically, which means keep interest rates for the private sector high. We should be targeting at private sector growth, not government sector growth. This way, tax collection will grow to allow for more spending on social services.
That's an important question from Mr. Hamusute. So there are a couple of things there. So some of them are pretty ideological. He makes the argument that private sector is the engine of growth and development. I think the historical record might say something quite nuanced, right? That you need strong government. That's the US case. The funny thing about the US is that they have so possessed us, and then they have weaved narratives that almost lie to us. I look at, for example, Apple Computers, which is the iconic company of now, right? A lot of the technology that Apple uses right now, touchscreen technology, Siri, if you want to say, you know where they came from, Pilato? They came from the research labs in the Department of Defense. So these were government did the massive heavy lifting, GPS, touchscreen technology, and then Apple harvested. So actually what you need more than anything else, it's not an either or kind of thing. At private sector, no government. We need a large government that is spending on the basic research, funding the universities so that we can be realizing some of these technologies. Now, he makes the other argument about the deficit can only be reduced by reducing expenditure. Now, remember, I said government expenditure is here, tax revenues are here. So this is the gap, right? So you can close the deficit by reducing government expenditure, or you can increase tax receipts and you can close the deficit and do it and pace yourself and do it systematically. What we have done, we've cut corporate income tax from 35% to 30%. By the way, that's just a nominal figure. Effectively, we know our companies very temwa, what's it called? I mean, this is not Grieve saying it. ActionAid has put out the reports. Oxfam has put out the report. Mwaliwa tax avoidance, so the effective collection rate isn't much lower. But what we have done is we've given them a gift, the corporate sector. Pilato. We've given the mining houses a gift. Pilato. So that's my point, Mr. Hamsute. It's not axiomatic. It's not the case that by definition the fiscal deficit can only be closed by reducing government expenditure. No, you could also increase revenues. You could do it. It's a stroke of a pen. You could do that. You could pace yourself also. Yeah.
Mr. Joshua Ngoma says, great point, Dr. Grieve Chelwa. While the IMF interest rate is lower than borrowing from capital markets, the conditions and terms of borrowing from the IMF, which the current government has not made public, are not friendly for poor third world countries like Zambia. So because this one is agreeing with you, I would like to add another question from Mr. William Mkata. Mr. William Mkata says, Mr. Chelwa, also talk about 100% foreign currency retention through export of our minerals. Why bypass instead to our money markets? I don't know what that means, but I'm sure you understand it better.
Yeah, that's an excellent point by Mr. Nkanta.
I'm looking for comments from women. I like to hear what women think on these issues. So I'm looking for a comment or comments from women now before we call the program. We conclude the program. You can respond to that one, Dr.
Thank you, Pilato. So Mr. Nkata's point is an excellent one. This is an argument Zambians have been making since we privatized the mines. Why is it that when our mining houses sell copper, they first of all part that money, the dollars they receive after selling copper, they first of all part it abroad, and then they remit to Zambia the necessary amounts needed to meet Zambian obligations, like taxes, if they're even paying the taxes, paying workers, firiafine. What Mr. Nkata is saying is actually the reverse, which is what most reasonable Zambians have been arguing. That money should first of all be deposited in a domestic account in the central bank, in total. And then they can remit dividends to the shareholders offshore, firiafine. But first of all, the money should come here first, so that we know how much it is. And then they should remit external obligations, as opposed to what they do now. They pack it offshore and then they remit minimal Zambian obligations. And what Mr. Nkata is saying, if that were the case, we could then power local money markets, right? And then we can resolve some of these shortage of foreign currency shortage issues. That's the argument Mr. Nkata is making. And again, you see, this is why it's so important to constitute a team of people with diverse viewpoints. You've seen in this particular program.
Yeah,
with Vashailun Dabachi Sabalandapo with his own view, which I respect. Other people have also come with different versions. And we've got a rich report which we can then submit to the president, which allows the president to make the best decision given all options. And the best decision might actually require a combination of different options. It's not the case that, the decision is just one option. Maybe we combine different options. That might be a thing, yeah.
So this one is called Daniel C. Kais. I've looked for comments from ladies and women. I've not found one a question or so. I would like us to address this one. So this one says, good evening, Comrade Pilato and Mr. Chelwa. I'm following this discussion attentively, and it's so far so good, also quite impressive. Mr. Chelwa, in your answering one of the questions imposed, you mentioned that the majority poor will not benefit from the IMF good deal perspective. Don't you think if the inflation and the exchange rate decreases, the fuel pump price will come down also, and eventually will benefit us all? Thank you.
Yeah, that's an excellent question from Mr. Kais there. I think he's, I think the vice president didn't make this argument in parliament that the prices have to go up and then subsequently come down. I mean, it's an impressive argument. So it's fascinating. I think I'm challenged by it. It's a very nice argument. It is possible that if we stabilize macroeconomic issues the way the IMF wants us to stabilize them, the exchange rate might come down, inflation comes down, and then subsequently the fuel prices that went up might also subsequently come down. It is possible. I think there's a field in economics called Keynesian economics. The Keynesians tend to say prices are sticky downwards. So when prices go up, it's very difficult for them to go down. They're much easier to go up than they are to come down. So I hope Mr. Kais is right. It's possible.
So I keep finding this question. Let me see if I can find it, but I've seen it a number of times. And there are people that are arguing with you that what makes you think that the government did not consult? Let me see if I can find this question. But I think it's one of the questions that this one is actually very upset with you. Hello, Dr. Grieve. Are you saying Zambian experts were not consulted? This one is not upset. Are you saying that Zambian experts were not consulted when taking the current path? Is there a possibility that there are other factors at play that you are not privy to, probably meant private to? Or would you agree that when it comes to GRZ, there are things that make the process not as straightforward as we would love it to be, following with an open mind? So that's Mutazi's blue. Mutazi is asking, are you saying the experts were not consulted? Is there a possibility that there were other factors at play that you are not privy to? Would you agree that when it comes to GRZ, there are other things that make the process not as straightforward as we would love it to be? Thank you.
I mean, that's an interesting question. I think, by the way, in a democracy, the government is it Lincoln who said it's a government of the people, by the people, for the people. It's such a consultative process, to my mind, should have been a transparent process, should have been systematic. You put together the way, I mean, for example, when the president invokes the Inquiries Act, I mean, when we've wanted, for example, to change the constitution, the president has invoked the Inquiries Act, put together a commission of inquiry chaired by commissions who go out and bring back a report to the president. And this is a public thing. Right now, consultation of this nature, consultation of a seismic policy shift like this is a huge deal, right? That's going to inflict pain on our people. If it did, it cannot happen in secret. This is something that has to happen transparently. A committee of experts has to be constituted, transparently so. And we have to know who those experts are, their qualifications to serve as experts. And then they put together a report that they give to the president. Right, and they might then subsequently also give out a redacted version of a report, a summary of what they told the president. Right, I think this is important. Right, this is important. It gives the people, government of the people, by the people, for the people. It gives the people confidence. Okay, the president has decided to go with this route. Okay, this was the result of a transparent process, consultative, publicly so, systematic, and it led to this policy choice. Okay, fine, that's all right. Right. So I think, I mean, I'm sure there were consultations. I mean, I don't think the president sits in a vacuum or sits in his office and thinks up these things. He talks to people, obviously. But I wish that process was much more systematic, much more transparent, much more open, allowing Pilato also to make a submission, allowing Grieve to make a submission, allowing Wazulu, who has just asked the question, to make a submission. I think that is how we strengthen our democracy. That's just me, and that's what I think. This is how we strengthen democracy. This is how we carry people along with us in policy making. I think there's been a lot of discussion that, people feel a certain way about these policy choices. I think, I mean, it's not brief to be so controversial to say people feel strange, people feel left behind. There's been discussion about people feel cheated. And I think part of that is the process by which this policy choice was arrived at. I wish that process was much more transparent, much more systematic in the ways that I've articulated in this hour, Pilato. That's the point I'm making.
Okay, I wanted to read this one because this guy is very upset with you. So I wanted to, so that you can. He's very upset with you. So he says, this is K. Actually, K is female, and we're happy that we got something from K, and we hope to get some more input from ladies. So K says, Dr. Grieve, you're being condescending by thinking that the president and his advisors didn't exhaust the ideas you're projecting. Did you by any chance ask them and they responded by saying they were short of ideas? Reading books about swimming don't make one a swimmer. Allow the empiricists to do their job.
Well, I mean, it's an ad hominem attack. I mean, I'm just but a book reader. I mean, so I have no idea. I mean,
But that's what we say about you economists. You, we find it easy to attack you from that angle. Uh, I would like us to conclude the program, but obviously I would like you to make your concluding remarks, and then we can say bye to our viewers.
I mean, by the way, my remarks are just to say thanks again for creating this platform at Pilato. I mean, I'm a big fan of yours, and thanks for inviting me to sort of be in conversation with you. Look, I mean, one of the things that's really impressive about what happened post August 12 is that there's healthy debate. I like it. I mean,
yes,
the debate is really, I mean, it's a debate about policies, and reasonable people can disagree about policies because, like I said, there is no policy that is beneficial to everybody. Policies have different beneficiaries, different constituents who are beneficiaries, different constituents who have costs, and so on and so forth. And this is what we're debating here. And I like this. I mean, this is quite different from what happened in the previous government, where such healthy debate wasn't even there. So I really like this moment. And as an academic, as a scholar, as a public intellectual, I'm thriving in this new type of dispensation where we're debating ideas. I mean, I certainly disagree with the policy choice that the government has picked in this particular moment, and reasonable people can disagree, obviously. But I've also sort of given here what the basis of my disagreement is. Like I said, policy has got different constituents and beneficiaries and folks who bear the cost. So for me, I think the most important constituency here are the poor, right? The left behind, the marginalized. And I feel that in this particular moment, they'll be left behind. By the way, I mean, as I was preparing for this discussion, I read the latest labor force survey report from the National Statistics Agency, 2020. But Pilato, 9 million of our people are in the working age population. They're in the population that's supposed to be working. Do you know how many of those have jobs? About 2.9 million. We have a huge problem on our hands. We have a huge problem on our hands to create employment. Huge problem on our hands. And I think austerity, the direction of austerity, the direction of relying on the private sector alone to create jobs, the direction of tax incentives to foreign investors, I don't think this would generate the number of jobs we need to really dent that unemployment problem, that problem of misuse of people. We're misusing people that God gave us, right? 9 million people in the working age population, only about 2.9 are working, 1 million are formally employed. The other ones are just eking out a living somewhere in there as trading and that kind of stuff. And I don't think this policy path that we're on will create enough jobs, meaningful jobs, that can close that employment gap. So this is the basis of my disagreement with the government's current policy choice.
Thank you very much, Doc, and always a pleasure speaking to you. And I do hope that when we come back knocking on your doors, you'll be welcoming and will accept to speak with us next time.
For you, Pilato, anytime. you are a national treasure. Who am I to say no to a national treasure?
So thank you very much. So thank you very much for everybody that tuned in and participated in this conversation. I am back here next week, same time, and obviously on a different topic. I would be happy if we could speak to somebody from the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Finance. But I'm also happy to say we might not talk about the IMF next week. We might subject next week. but be sure to join us and be part of the conversation. And let's share ideas and see how we can contribute to constructive conversations in the country. Thank you very much. And Twaranda New Year. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Happy 2022.
Happy 2022.